I am Victoria. On the day the crown found me, I was just a girl of 18. But I ruled not just a kingdom, but an empire that spanned the globe. From this throne, I ushered in the greatest age of British power. I was queen. I am Victoria. On the day the crown found me, I was just a girl of 18. But I ruled not just a kingdom, but an empire that spanned the globe. From this throne, I ushered in the greatest age of British power. I was queen.
She entered the world not with royal trumpets or the glow of destiny, but in the quiet half-light of a spring dawn, in a small room within Kensington Palace that smelled faintly of beeswax, book leather, and London's ever-present fog. It was May 24, 1819, when Alexandrina Victoria, a tiny infant with blue eyes and a soft cry, was born into a royal family fractured by scandal, rivalry, and uncertainty. No one expected greatness from her. No one imagined she would rule an empire that stretched across continents, or that her name would define an entire century. She was simply a child, frail at birth, with a destiny still hidden beneath layers of political intrigue and dynastic desperation. Yet even in those early hours, when she clung to her mother's finger and studied the world through curious eyes, there was something watchful about her gaze, a quiet alertness, a sense of waiting. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died before she was a year old, leaving Victoria and her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg, alone in a palace filled with whispers and power games. Her mother, German, isolated and fiercely protective, clung to her daughter as if she were both shield and weapon. Surrounding them was the notorious Sir John Conroy, a man who maneuvered through the palace like a shadow, whispering advice to the widowed duchess, attempting to shape the young princess into a tool for his political ambition. They constructed what became known as the Kensington system, a suffocating web of rules meant to control every aspect of Victoria's childhood. She was never allowed to walk down a staircase without someone holding her hand, never allowed to play with children her own age, never allowed to sleep alone. Privacy, independence, spontaneity, these were luxuries she never tasted. Her days unfolded with mechanical precision. Dawn lessons in handwriting, languages, and scripture, breakfast under the watchful eyes of governesses, afternoons of music drills, evenings absorbed in supervised reading. The corridors of Kensington Palace became her entire world. She listened to tutors with the obedience expected of a princess, yet inside a rebellion simmered, quiet, patient, but unmistakable. She learned early to mask her feelings, to protect her thoughts, to speak only when necessary. She grew up in a palace, yes, but she grew up lonely, surrounded not by friends or siblings, but by adults discussing politics, alliances, and her place in a future they intended to control. But loneliness did not crush her. It strengthened her. It forced her inward, sharpening her observations, deepening her empathy. She watched people, not just their words, but their motives, their postures, the subtext beneath every gesture. She learned caution, softness, strategy, and restraint, all qualities that would one day define her rule. The young Victoria adopted the habit of writing everything she felt into journals, pouring onto the page the emotions she could not safely express aloud. These writings would become a lifelong discipline, and eventually one of the most detailed first-person recordings of any monarch in history. Through her childhood, she clung to one source of affection, her beloved dog, Dash, and her governess, Louise Lezen, a calm, maternal presence who offered the warmth and loyalty missing from everyone else around her. Lezen believed in Victoria, not as a political instrument, but as a girl with a mind sharp enough to see through the games of adults. She nurtured not submission, but strength, feeding the quiet resilience already sprouting in Victoria's heart. And in secret, she encouraged what the Kensington system feared most: independence. As the years passed, the question of succession loomed over the monarchy. The reigning king, George IV, was aging and childless. His successor, William IV, was frail and had no legitimate heirs. Victoria, this small girl raised in isolation, suddenly became the future of the British throne. And when royal visitors arrived at Kensington Palace, they observed her with increasing interest. They found her small but sturdy, modest yet determined, still shy but with a dignity that seemed to bloom naturally around her. Meanwhile, Conroy tightened his grip, urging the Duchess to pressure Victoria into signing documents granting him power as her future regent. Victoria, small but fierce in spirit, refused. She may have been raised in confinement, but her inner world, built on journals, lessons, observation, and stubborn dignity, belonged entirely to her. She resented Conroy's suffocating presence. She felt his manipulation, and though young, she understood that yielding to him would imprison her future as surely as the Kensington system had imprisoned her childhood. By the time she turned 11, an important moment ignited a new truth inside her. Her uncle, King William IV, brought her before a genealogical chart and showed her clearly, beautifully, undeniably, that she was next in line for the throne. "I will be good," she whispered, a promise not of obedience, but of purpose. That quiet vow became the seed of her destiny. Her teenage years unfolded as a delicate tug-of-war between her mother's suffocating dependence and Victoria's growing need for autonomy. She could not walk alone. She could not choose her own clothes. She could not correspond without inspection. And yet the world beyond the palace walls waited for her. A world of powerful men, global politics, industrial change, and an empire about to transform into the largest in human history. The closer she grew to adulthood, the more the British government watched her with anticipation. Her discipline, her intelligence, her attention to detail, qualities forged in confinement, were becoming impossible to overlook. Then, in the early hours of June 20th, 1837, everything changed. King William IV died, and messengers rushed through the dawn mist toward Kensington Palace. Victoria, only 18, was woken gently and told that she was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. She stood there, small, pale, and barefoot, yet every trace of childhood seemed to fall away in that instant. A lifetime of observation, silence, study, loneliness, and emotional restraint condensed into a single moment of clarity. For the first time in her life, she demanded one thing with unwavering authority: "I wish to be alone." It was her first act as queen, and a symbol of what was to come. The child who had never been allowed privacy now stepped into power alone, determined to carve her reign by her own decisions, her own heart, her own vision. The world waited. Ministers bowed. History held its breath. The lonely girl of Kensington had become queen, and the Victorian era, an age that would reshape science, morality, empire, and identity, had begun. The dawn of Victoria's reign was quiet, almost intimate, despite the magnitude of the moment. Kensington Palace, usually a cage of shadows and whispers, now seemed to echo with potential rather than fear. The corridors, once oppressive with the weight of rules, suddenly felt like halls of possibility. The 18-year-old queen, small in stature but vast in resolve, had stepped into a role that centuries of precedent had shaped, yet she intended to define it in her own terms. Alone, she embraced the paradox of her new life, surrounded by power, yet entirely reliant on her inner compass. Her first days as sovereign were measured, deliberate, a series of gestures that revealed a mind both cautious and audacious. She listened, asked questions, observed, and most importantly, remembered. Every whisper in the cabinet rooms, every measured smile from ministers, every flicker of flattery or caution, All were recorded in her mind and her journals. Victoria understood that to rule, one had to first understand the currents beneath the surface, the personalities, the alliances, the ambitions, the fears. She had been trained for obedience, but now she would transform that training into mastery. Her advisors, seasoned men of state, accustomed to kings of indulgence and eccentricity, were at first unsure how to respond to this new sovereign. They expected timidity, perhaps a puppet, perhaps a girl overwhelmed by ceremony and history. But Victoria carried herself with a mixture of innocence and gravity that disarmed them. Her blue eyes, steady and unyielding, betrayed nothing, yet seemed to assess everything. She spoke with quiet authority, her sentences precise, her expectations clear. In moments of disagreement, she did not shout or tremble, she simply waited, letting silence become a tool, a signal that her will was not to be underestimated.
From the very first, she demonstrated a rare blend of empathy and intelligence. She remembered faces, preferred counsel over spectacle, and sought information from every corner of the empire. She began to study law, finance, and diplomacy, determined to understand the machinery of government not as a distant observer, but as an active participant. She recognized the delicate balance of power in Britain's constitutional monarchy, that her authority was both immense and constrained, and that mastery of influence often mattered more than the blunt exercise of command. The Queen's personality, formed in isolation, sharpened by observation, tempered by loneliness, began to crystallize. She possessed an instinctive sense of propriety and fairness, yet her judgment was uncompromising. Flattery and intimidation were tools she met with silence and scrutiny. She admired courage and counsel and honesty in those who served her, and she expected loyalty, not sycophancy, from those around her. Ministers learned quickly that to advise Victoria was to speak truth, not flattery. To challenge her was permissible, even necessary, but deception was intolerable. Her first tests came swiftly. Parliament awaited, political factions jostled, and whispers of reform rippled across London. Radical thinkers demanded change. Conservatives clung to tradition. The Queen understood that every action, every approval or denial would set a precedent. At the age of 18, she was not merely a figurehead. She was a living symbol of continuity, stability, and the potential for transformation. Every decision, however small, carried the weight of history. One of the earliest lessons of governance struck in the delicate negotiation with her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. A man of experience, patience, and subtle intellect, Melbourne became both guide and test. He taught Victoria the nuances of cabinet discussion, the importance of listening as a form of influence, and the art of wielding authority without spectacle. Yet he also witnessed her resolve, a young queen who, though willing to learn, would never allow herself to be subdued or dictated to. Their relationship became a model of mentorship, respect, and cautious partnership, an essential foundation for a monarch who would soon navigate crises of unprecedented scale. Victoria's personal life, still private but increasingly entwined with duty, reflected the tension between confinement and independence that had defined her childhood. She lived with constant reminders of her upbringing, the rigid schedules, the ceremonial expectations, the watchful eyes of courtiers. Yet she began to assert herself in small, deliberate ways, choosing her own daily routines, managing her correspondence personally, and engaging directly with the people whose lives she now influenced. Each act of autonomy, no matter how minute, was a declaration that the girl who had been controlled by the Kensington system was now the master of her destiny. Challenges arose quickly from multiple fronts. Ireland, already restless, demanded attention. Tensions within the empire required careful management, and domestic pressures, from economic unrest to social reform, tested both her patience and her judgment. Victoria, however, approached each crisis with methodical calm. She took the time to read reports herself, to meet with advisors, to question and analyze, and to act decisively when necessary. In doing so, she demonstrated a rare combination of diligence and intuition, qualities that would define the earliest years of her reign. Even within the palace, the young queen faced obstacles. Her mother, still protective and ambitious, occasionally tried to exert influence, yet Victoria's insistence on independence became increasingly firm. Louise Ledzin, though aging, continued to serve as confidant and moral anchor, offering counsel not in commands, but in quiet guidance. And beyond the palace walls, the world observed closely. A young queen, barely an adult, tasked with governing one of the most powerful nations on earth. The stakes were enormous, yet Victoria's poise and diligence inspired a growing respect even among skeptics. It was during these formative months that Victoria's understanding of public perception deepened. She realized that her reign was not merely about governance, but also about symbol, ceremony, and the projection of stability. Every appearance, every public speech, every acknowledgement of tradition or innovation communicated both power and empathy. The young queen learned to balance her natural inclination toward introspection with the necessity of visibility, to present herself as both human and sovereign, relatable yet unassailable. This delicate equilibrium would become a hallmark of the Victorian image, simultaneously approachable and majestic, personal and political.
Her character continued to solidify in private moments, the ones unseen by historians and ministers. She wrote with increasing discipline, chronicling every encounter, reflection, and emotion in her journals. Here, in ink and paper, she examined her own motives, rehearsed her decisions, and recorded her fears. It was a practice born from childhood isolation, but repurposed for governance, a tool of self-knowledge and self-mastery. These writings, candid and meticulous, would later provide posterity with a window into the mind of a queen who balanced personal sentiment with imperial responsibility. By the end of her first year as monarch, Victoria had already begun to define the parameters of her authority. She was small in stature, yet immense in presence. She was young, yet astonishingly poised. She was still the girl of Kensington, yet now the woman of the empire. Every lesson from her childhood, the vigilance, the discipline, the observation, the journals, the resilience, had coalesced into a singular force of purpose. She was not merely inheriting a throne, she was inheriting history, and she intended to shape it, and shape it she would. The first months of her reign revealed a queen unafraid to assert herself, yet guided by prudence, to wield influence, yet respect counsel, to embody both tradition and innovation. It was a delicate dance, and one she learned with astonishing speed. Victoria understood that the world she governed was complex, expansive, and volatile. Nations watched Britain, economies fluctuated, social movements stirred, and technology promised change. The young queen embraced the responsibility with a sense of quiet determination, knowing that each choice, however small, rippled across continents. Victoria's early reign was a crucible. It tested her intellect, her judgment, her patience, and her resolve. And it forged in her the qualities that would come to define the Victorian era: resilience in the face of challenge, moral seriousness tempered by empathy, a commitment to duty tempered by personal conviction, and a keen awareness of the intricate interplay between authority and responsibility. She was no longer simply a lonely girl of Kensington. She was a monarch poised to lead an empire, and in doing so, to shape the character of a century. By 1840, 3 years into her reign, Victoria had already established herself as a monarch of precision, intellect, and moral resolve. Yet despite the weight of the crown, there remained a space in her life that was profoundly personal, quietly yearning for companionship, understanding, and emotional partnership. That space would soon be filled by a man whose intellect matched her own, whose values aligned with hers, and whose presence would forever alter both her life and the image of monarchy itself: Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their first encounter was unassuming, almost ordinary, yet it carried the seed of extraordinary influence. Albert was introduced as a young German prince, well-educated, disciplined, and deeply committed to public service. Victoria, always alert to character, observed him closely. She noted his seriousness, his intellect, his awareness of duty, and the subtle kindness that shone through his formality. It was not love at first sight in the way fairy tales describe it. It was recognition, a meeting of minds, a shared moral compass, and a glimpse of a partnership that could strengthen both crown and person. The court, initially skeptical, watched as Victoria's choice became clear. In February 1840, she and Albert were married, and the ceremony, though traditional and stately, carried the intimacy of mutual respect. For Victoria, it was a union of equals, a joining of hearts and minds that extended beyond mere dynastic politics. Albert became not only consort, but advisor, confidant, and partner in governance, a man whose counsel she trusted implicitly, yet who never overshadowed her authority. Together, they navigated the intricacies of a monarchy under intense scrutiny, balancing public expectations with personal devotion. Domestic life in Windsor and Kensington offered Victoria a new dimension of her identity. For the first time, she experienced partnership in decision-making, shared responsibilities, and the quiet joys of family. Albert's presence was stabilizing. His intellect complemented her instinct, and his moral seriousness reinforced the discipline Victoria had cultivated since childhood. Their home became a sanctuary, where love and duty coexisted, where letters and journals continued to record observations, and where Victoria's sense of independence remained intact, now strengthened rather than diminished by marriage.
The birth of their first child, Princess Victoria, marked another profound transition. Motherhood, long anticipated yet approached with the same diligence that characterized every aspect of her life, became an extension of Victoria's sense of responsibility. She applied the same meticulous care to her children as she did to her monarchy, blending affection with moral instruction, protection with guidance. Family life did not diminish her public duties. It deepened her understanding of human motivation, of the fragility and resilience of those she governed. Her journals, rich with reflection, reveal a queen who balanced love, duty, and personal reflection with remarkable skill. Concurrently, Victoria and Albert consolidated their power and influence within the British government. Though constrained by constitutional limits, the Queen understood the subtleties of persuasion, the rhythm of negotiation, and the power of moral authority. Albert, ever strategic, advised on matters ranging from infrastructure to education, from international diplomacy to public works. Together, they crafted a vision of monarchy that was both active and morally grounded, a model for an era in which the sovereign was both symbolic figurehead and active participant in guiding national life. Public perception of Victoria shifted dramatically during these years. Initially, her youth and relative inexperience invited scrutiny and doubt. Some critics questioned whether she could sustain the burdens of empire, whether her moral rigor might render her inflexible. Yet as she engaged more visibly with social causes, attended public ceremonies, and received foreign dignitaries, a new narrative emerged. The young queen was diligent, compassionate, intelligent, and dignified. She embodied the ideal of moral leadership, a figure whose personal integrity reinforced her political authority. Her reign became a measure not only of governance, but of example, an ethical template for the nation and the empire. Even in matters of diplomacy, Victoria's personal sense of propriety and insight proved invaluable. Correspondence with foreign monarchs, careful observation of ministers' debates, and her nuanced understanding of public sentiment allowed her to influence outcomes without overstepping constitutional bounds. She learned early the importance of subtlety, of patience, of letting principles guide action rather than impulse. Albert, often by her side, strengthened this approach, providing counsel and analysis, but the decisions, the ultimate authority, remained Victoria's. In this partnership, the Queen honed her diplomatic instincts, preparing for crises and negotiations that would define her era. Yet power and domestic life were not without challenge. Balancing a growing family, court expectations, public duties, and empire-wide responsibilities demanded discipline beyond most human experience. Victoria, though resilient, experienced the emotional weight of isolation even within marriage. She relied on Albert and trusted attendants, but she also leaned heavily on private reflection, writing, and contemplation. In the quiet moments of Windsor, she recorded thoughts that bridged the personal and political, revealing a monarch deeply aware that the emotional and ethical dimensions of leadership were inseparable. The 1840s, a decade of consolidation and preparation, also saw Victoria navigating public crises and expectations. Industrial unrest, the Irish famine, and social change required her attention and measured response. She grasped early that monarchy's moral authority could complement parliamentary governance, that public example, temperance, diligence, compassion, carried significance beyond mere legislation. Her engagements, carefully selected and executed, reinforced her image as a queen both close to her people and elevated above petty factionalism. Newspapers began to report on her personal virtues alongside her political actions. She became a symbol of stability in a rapidly changing world. At court, the relationship with Albert strengthened, but it also transformed the culture of monarchy itself. Their emphasis on family, morality, and duty established a template that contrasted sharply with previous generations of indulgent or capricious rulers. Victoria's personal example, her attention to children, her meticulous observation of protocol, and her seriousness about public responsibility became inseparable from the institution she represented. The Queen was not merely a figurehead, she was a living standard, a benchmark of conduct, and a guide to the character of her nation. By the end of the decade, Victoria's reign had moved beyond survival into deliberate shaping. She had transformed youth and inexperience into authority and foresight. The partnership with Albert had stabilized governance, enhanced public confidence, and provided a foundation for domestic and imperial reform. The Queen's moral seriousness, combined with the practical intelligence honed since Kensington, created a model of monarchy that balanced duty with humanity, authority with empathy. In the eyes of Britain and the wider world, Victoria was no longer simply a young queen. She was a sovereign capable of guiding her people through tumultuous times while embodying the ideals she had cultivated from childhood. And yet, for all the weight of empire, for all the demands of public life, Victoria remained profoundly human. She laughed with her children, mourned personal losses, wrote letters filled with love and anxiety, and recorded her thoughts with scrupulous honesty. In these private moments, she revealed the depth beneath the crown, the heart and mind that would sustain the British monarchy through decades of change. Her ability to balance personal devotion with public duty, intimacy with authority, and reflection with action marked the beginning of a reign that would endure longer and with greater influence than almost any before or since. In marriage, family, and governance, Victoria discovered a powerful truth. Authority is most enduring when it is informed by intellect, guided by conscience, and exercised with humanity. She had transformed confinement into clarity, loneliness into observation, youth into wisdom, and moral seriousness into both personal and political power. The early years of her reign, steeped in reflection, discipline, and partnership, laid the foundations for the century that would bear her name. The young queen who had walked alone through Kensington's shadowed halls now moved confidently into history's light, ready to meet the challenges of empire, society, and change with a steady hand and a resolute heart. As the 1840s unfolded, Victoria's reign entered a period that would test her judgment, empathy, and resilience like never before. The crown, once a symbol of ceremony, now demanded decisive action amid the turbulence of a transforming society. Britain was not the world her father or grandfather had known. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped its cities, its labor, and its economy. Steam, steel, and mechanized labor brought wealth and progress, but also suffering, exploitation, and unrest. Victoria, young yet deeply observant, recognized that the monarchy could not remain a mere spectator to history. It had to embody moral authority and measured engagement. One of the earliest and most harrowing challenges came from Ireland. The Great Famine, beginning in 1845, revealed the stark limits of government and the fragility of human life. Millions faced starvation, disease, and displacement. Victoria, informed daily by ministers and reports, was struck not only by the scale of suffering, but by the human faces behind each number. Her journals record moments of profound distress. Children dying of hunger, families torn apart, villages abandoned. She felt the weight of responsibility intensely, writing to Albert about the need for decisive compassion. Though constrained by constitutional limits, she supported relief efforts and sought to bring moral focus to government responses. It was here, in the crucible of human suffering, that Victoria's empathy became inseparable from her authority, a queen who observed, judged, and acted not merely as a figurehead, but as a conscience for the nation. Industrial unrest presented a different, more abstract challenge. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds teemed with workers demanding better conditions, wages, and representation. Factories produced goods at an unprecedented pace, but human cost was staggering. Victoria, educated in both duty and observation, understood that the monarchy's role was not to dictate economics, but to symbolize fairness and stability. She championed charitable works, encouraged reform-minded ministers, and used her visibility to highlight the importance of responsibility among industrialists. Her attention to detail and her commitment to moral principle gradually shaped public perception. The crown was not distant, indulgent, or indifferent. It was engaged, aware, and accountable. Amid these public challenges, Victoria's personal life remained deeply intertwined with duty. Albert's role as consort became increasingly central, not only in domestic matters, but also in governance and reform. Together, they promoted education, the arts, and scientific advancement. Albert encouraged the Queen's interest in architecture, infrastructure, and social improvement, and she in turn used her influence to support initiatives ranging from railways to charitable institutions. The royal household became a model of disciplined efficiency and moral leadership, reflecting the values that Victoria had long nurtured in her journals and reflections.
Her family life was not merely private, it became an instrument through which the crown projected stability, responsibility, and vision. The period also marked the maturation of Victoria's public image. Portraits, official appearances, and correspondence cultivated a perception of the Queen as both sovereign and symbol, regal yet approachable, morally serious yet compassionate, disciplined yet attentive to human need. She understood that the monarchy's authority depended as much on perception as on constitutional prerogative. Every public action, carefully measured, was a demonstration of the values she wished to embody: duty, integrity, compassion, and foresight. Her example set the tone for Victorian society itself, where moral responsibility and public service became intertwined ideals. Education and intellectual engagement remained central to Victoria's personal development. She continued to read extensively, correspond with thinkers, and observe developments across the empire. Her notebooks reveal a monarch attuned to the currents of history, aware that industrial innovation, colonial expansion, and social change would define the century. Yet she approached this awareness with the same humility and caution that had defined her early reign. Knowledge was a tool, reflection a practice, and action a responsibility. In these early decades, Victoria transformed from a young observer into a seasoned participant in the shaping of Britain's future. Internationally, the young queen's influence extended through diplomacy and family networks. Europe, still marked by revolution, shifting alliances, and dynastic ambition, demanded vigilance. Victoria corresponded with foreign monarchs, assessed geopolitical threats, and cultivated relationships that would later prove invaluable. Her moral authority lent weight to her diplomatic voice, even in a constitutional monarchy where ultimate power rested with elected officials.
Through intelligence, empathy, and disciplined observation, she positioned herself not as a passive emblem, but as an active, principled actor on the world stage. Throughout these crises, Victoria never lost sight of the personal dimensions of leadership. She understood that a monarch's authority relied on trust, loyalty, and example. She took time to visit the sick, to correspond with citizens in distress, and to encourage charitable efforts. She recognized the symbolic power of personal presence. A queen who demonstrated concern, courage, and care could inspire more than decrees or legislation alone. The combination of moral integrity, visible engagement, and administrative diligence became a hallmark of her reign, creating a bond between sovereign and people that would endure for decades. By the end of the 1840s, Victoria had emerged from her early reign profoundly transformed. The lonely girl of Kensington had become a monarch capable of navigating crises of unprecedented complexity, combining empathy with authority, reflection with decisive action. The Irish famine, industrial unrest, political debate, and international tension had tested her resolve, sharpened her intellect, and deepened her understanding of the moral dimensions of power. She had learned that sovereignty was not merely inherited, it was cultivated, exercised, and constantly refined. In these formative years, Victoria also discovered the inseparable relationship between personal integrity and public trust. Every decision, every gesture, every public appearance was an opportunity to reinforce the values she cherished: honesty, diligence, compassion, and responsibility. The crown, once a symbol of inherited privilege, became an instrument of moral guidance, a lens through which society could observe discipline, conscience, and measured leadership. Victoria understood that her example would resonate far beyond the halls of Buckingham or Kensington. It would echo across an empire and define an era. As the decade closed, the Queen faced the dawning realization that her reign would span generations. The empire's expansion, industrial transformation, and social change meant that the challenges before her were not temporary, they were defining. Yet Victoria's early experiences, shaped by isolation, observation, and disciplined reflection, had prepared her to meet these challenges with steadiness and insight. She had become a monarch who could absorb the weight of history without being crushed, who could balance principle with pragmatism, and who could wield authority without sacrificing humanity. The Victorian era, still in its infancy, began to take shape not only through legislation, diplomacy, and industry, but through the moral and intellectual character of its sovereign. Victoria's leadership, tempered by empathy, disciplined by reflection, and reinforced by partnership with Albert, would set a standard for monarchy, society, and empire. The foundations laid in these years of crisis and consolidation would endure through decades of change, shaping both the crown and the people it served. The young queen, once confined by rules, isolated by circumstance, and underestimated by those around her, had now assumed the full measure of responsibility, authority, and moral weight. The stage was set for an era that would bear her name, a century of transformation, achievement, and challenge, guided in no small measure by the character of the monarch who had learned to turn loneliness into wisdom, observation into strategy, and principle into power. The 1850s opened a chapter of Victoria's life in which personal devotion and public duty became inseparably intertwined. The Queen, now in her early 30s, had settled into a rhythm defined by family, governance, and moral purpose. Albert, ever the intellectual and practical partner, remained both confidant and strategist, guiding not just the household, but also shaping the monarchy's role in public life. Their union, forged in mutual respect and shared vision, became a model for monarchy itself, a partnership of equals, grounded in intellect, morality, and a profound understanding of responsibility. Victoria's family expanded steadily. Between 1840 and 1857, she bore 9 children, each arrival celebrated with quiet joy and disciplined care. Motherhood was, for Victoria, an extension of duty, a way to instill moral seriousness, intellectual curiosity, and ethical responsibility in the next generation. She approached each child with meticulous attention, documenting growth, health, and education in journals that mirrored those of her own childhood. Her devotion to family did not diminish her reign, rather, it reinforced the image of a sovereign who understood responsibility both in private and public life. The home became a microcosm of the society she hoped to influence, disciplined, nurturing, principled, and aware of its place in the larger world. Albert's influence on culture, industry, and public morality deepened during these years. Together, the royal couple championed education, arts, and science, establishing institutions that reflected the Victorian values of progress tempered by ethical awareness. The Great Exhibition of 1851, an event Albert orchestrated and Victoria endorsed, symbolized Britain's industrial and cultural achievement. Victoria, ever perceptive of symbolism, understood the exhibition's broader significance. It showcased innovation while reinforcing the monarchy's role as patron, guide, and moral exemplar. The crown was no longer a distant ornament. It was actively shaping national identity, creativity, and enterprise. While domestic life flourished, external pressures demanded equal attention. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, cast a long shadow over Britain and its monarchy. Though Victoria had no direct command of the military, she engaged deeply with the human and political dimensions of the conflict. Letters and journals reveal a sovereign profoundly affected by the suffering of soldiers and the strategic complexities of war. She praised courage, demanded accountability from her ministers, and expressed public support for wounded soldiers and nurses, including Florence Nightingale. The Queen's engagement transformed perception. She was a monarch who felt, observed, and acted, whose empathy complemented the authority she wielded, reinforcing trust in her leadership even in times of national distress. Victoria's political influence matured through subtle yet decisive intervention. Mid-reign, she faced debates over reform bills, colonial expansion, and international diplomacy. Her counsel to prime ministers, whether Lord Palmerston, Lord Derby, or Benjamin Disraeli, was measured, informed, and morally grounded. She wielded influence not through decrees, but through personal authority, correspondence, and moral persuasion. Ministers quickly learned that the Queen's opinions carried weight. She could support, dissent, or guide, always balancing constitutional limits with the force of personal judgment. Her ability to navigate these complexities reflected lessons learned from her early isolation, disciplined observation, and intimate understanding of human motives. The domestic sphere, though private, served as a laboratory for broader lessons in leadership and governance. Victoria's family mirrored her vision for the empire. Children were educated rigorously, taught civic responsibility, and exposed to the values of morality, discipline, and intellectual engagement. Albert's insistence on practical education, combined with Victoria's emphasis on ethical awareness, produced a household that became an emblem of stability, guidance, and cultural refinement. Royal routines, from family meals to ceremonial observances, served as silent but potent demonstrations of order, propriety, and conscientiousness, reinforcing public perception of monarchy as a stabilizing force. Victoria's personal style and public image were equally deliberate. She cultivated a persona that was at once dignified and accessible. Through portraits, public appearances, and social engagements, she embodied the ideals of the age: moral rectitude, compassion, intellectual curiosity, and disciplined authority. She balanced visibility with discretion, ensuring that her presence inspired confidence rather than indulgence. Her image became inseparable from the cultural ethos she promoted, and the monarchy's influence extended far beyond politics into the moral imagination of the nation.
The 1850s and 1860s also saw Victoria's engagement with imperial affairs intensify. India, Canada, and Australia, critical components of the British Empire, demanded diplomatic awareness, symbolic support, and moral oversight. Victoria's letters, meetings with colonial governors, and careful observation of policy demonstrated a monarch attuned to both symbolic authority and practical consequence. She recognized that empire required stewardship, ethical consideration, and cultural awareness. Her guidance, often subtle but deeply informed, reinforced the legitimacy of the crown, while ensuring that Britain's expansion was accompanied by the principles of governance she valued. Amid these duties, personal grief and resilience became intertwined. The death of close advisors, the passing of family members, and later Albert's own health challenges tested Victoria profoundly. Yet she approached each loss with a combination of private mourning and public composure. Her journals reveal moments of profound sorrow, tempered by reflection and a commitment to duty. These experiences, painful yet instructive, strengthened her character and reinforced her understanding of leadership as a synthesis of personal integrity, emotional depth, and public responsibility. Victoria's reign during this period also witnessed the deepening of public loyalty. The Crown's engagement in social causes, its moral example, and the visible partnership between Victoria and Albert fostered trust and admiration. The public perceived a monarchy that was both elevated and relatable, a family, a symbol, and a guiding force. Ceremonial acts, state openings, public receptions, charitable patronage were infused with personal meaning, carefully crafted to demonstrate the Queen's values and reinforce national cohesion. Her attention to detail, moral seriousness, and personal discipline transformed the monarchy into an institution that combined ceremonial grandeur with practical, ethical influence. By the late 1860s, Victoria and Albert had established a model of monarchy that influenced both governance and culture. Victoria's personal habits, reading, journaling, meticulous observation, and disciplined engagement reinforced her political effectiveness. Albert's intellect, practicality, and organizational skill complemented her strengths, creating a partnership that defined an era. The Queen's ability to integrate personal life, public duty, moral authority, and political influence exemplified the unique synthesis that would mark the Victorian century. Victoria's early and mid-reign also set a precedent for the monarch's role in ethical and cultural guidance. She demonstrated that authority was most enduring when exercised with moral reflection, empathy, and disciplined judgment. She shaped public opinion not merely through laws or decrees, but through example, visibility, and the cultivation of trust. The values she embodied, duty, integrity, compassion, and foresight, became inseparable from the identity of the monarchy, influencing both contemporary society and the course of the empire. In this period, the Queen fully realized that her power extended beyond the palace walls. Influence, she understood, could be exercised through moral example, partnership, and careful counsel, rather than through coercion. Her reign, already decades long by the standards of history, was now anchored in both principle and practicality. Victoria had transformed from the lonely child of Kensington into a sovereign whose judgment, empathy, and vision defined not only her monarchy, but the century itself. As Victoria looked toward the future, she carried the lessons of childhood isolation, early reign, personal devotion, and imperial responsibility. Every decision, every engagement, every private reflection was part of a broader project to shape an era, to embody stability amid change, and to lead with both intellect